First, welcome everybody to our very first webinar this year, this semester. This is our 2024 SZ4Grads webinar for the fall semester. Welcome, Beth, for being our very first speaker. Thank you so much. Before we start the webinar, can I take 5 minutes to briefly introduce SZ4D, SZ4Grads, the webinar, and to other events that SZ4D and SZ4Net are going to host. So SZ4D stands for subduction zones in 4 dimensions. We're here to understand the limits and possibilities of predicting subduction zone geohazards. SZ4Grads is under the umbrella of SZ4D. It's for graduate students and early career researchers. It's a collaborative, interdisciplinary, and intercultural network for graduate students, and other the early career researchers. During the webinar, we have live translated closed captions, and we will have recordings up to YouTube for you to catch up later. So let me introduce the 2 events first. I'm sharing the screen. So firstly, there is a 2025 US and Chile exchange program. We have hosts from both United States and Chile. It's like a month-long research opportunity. You can scan the QR code, go to the website to see all the possible opportunities. It's open to students and early career scientists. You just have to fill up some forms, the questions, and we highly recommend you to contact your host before you apply for the opportunity. The application deadline would be November the 1st in 2024. The exchange time is pretty much flexible. As long as both of you are in agreement, you can just start. Anyway, scan the website, scan the QR code, go to the website. You will find more information about it. It's a lot of fun. And the other one is SZ4Net 2025 Chile field trip. It will be in January next year. It's like a 10-day field trip. It's open to everybody who is interested in the cross-disciplinary research. Again, just scan the QR code. And also, if you have already signed up to be in SZ4D listserv, you should be able to receive the emails 10 minutes ago. So if you sign up for SZ4Grads listserv, you're automatically signed up as one of the member in SZ4D. Yeah, just apply for those opportunities, and we are looking forward to your application. And now, lastly, we will start our webinar. It will be 45 to 50 minutes in presentation, and we will have 5 to 10 minutes for questions and answers. Today, our speaker is Beth. She has a very interesting CV. She got her bachelor's degree in 1994 in geology and Spanish in Whitman College. Then she got her geophysics master's degree in 2002 in Indiana University. And then she got another master's degree in journalism in University of Colorado in 2013. Afterwards, she got her geology PhD degree in Michigan Technology University in 2023. And now Beth is working as a postdoc in USGS. Welcome, and we're really looking forward to your presentation.
Thank you. Thank you so much. I'm going to go ahead and share my screen. If I can figure out, wow, there we go. The big green button. Okay, hopefully this is working now. Thank you so much for that introduction. Yeah, a lot of school, a lot of school, and hopefully it looks like this is a small enough group that if you have questions as we go, go ahead and stop me if you need to. I think I will have a hard time seeing the chat, but the you're wrong, and yeah, might be able to see the chat and give me a holler. So I'm here to talk about how understanding evacuation behavior can inform geoscience questions with a case study at Fuego Volcano in Guatemala. And I'm really excited to be presenting to SZ4D grads because I've been involved in SZ4D since the beginning. Now more so marginally, maybe I'll get more involved again. And I am really excited to talk about how our geoscience information can ideally inform risk reduction strategies, and subduction zones are my favorites. So subduction zones give us all sorts of opportunities to reduce risk, as you all know, because there are a lot of hazards associated with subduction zones. So Jurong already gave a great introduction to my educational pathway. I was going to tell you a little bit of how I got to where I am, and now I don't really have to, which is great. But right, so education in geology, geophysics, focused on volcanology or focused on volcano geodesy. I was a field engineer as well at UNAVCO, which is now EarthScope. For those who are familiar, got to work on some volcanoes through that as well. And then my journalism master's also focused on volcanoes. I interviewed folks living around an active volcano in Ecuador, Tungurahua, for those who are familiar. And then I was a communications specialist back at UNAVCO, now EarthScope, for 6 years before going on for that PhD in geology. And it may seem all random, but this PhD in geology and the work I'm doing now really brings everything together, I think. A lot of disparate interests. So it brings together that communication, understanding social dynamics, Earth systems, and how we can use our information to ideally reduce risk. And I want to give a shout out to my PhD advisor, Rudiger Escobar Wolf, who had a hand in a lot of the work that I'll be talking about today, and also Elsa Naismith, then of University of Bristol, now in Singapore, a co-author on one of my chapters and a co-conspirator in a lot of the work. And this work was not funded by a single NSF grant or a single other grant. It was really patched together from a lot of different grants. So thus a lot of different logos on this slide. And I am now a postdoc at the USGS working on some related work, but not directly with Guatemala anymore. So today I'm going to focus on the Guatemala work. So why Fuego? For those of you who are familiar with Fuego, you probably know why. It is a very active volcano. What you can see in the lower left is a typical eruption. These happen generally multiple times a day. It's been active since well before written records, and since written records in the 1500s, there are many documented eruptions, and it most recently, after a decade or two of quiet, reawoke in 1999 and has been persistently active since then. So like I said, what we can see here is typical explosion that we could see several times a day, sometimes as frequently as 5 minutes, every 5 minutes or so. So it is a very persistently active volcano, also with a large population around it. So this map in the center is the most recent hazard map for pyroclastic density currents, or PDCs. PDC is the collective term for pyroclastic flows and surges. So these hot avalanches of gas, rock, ash, other debris that can come down the flanks of a volcano and take out everything in their path. They are highly dangerous and destructive. So this is the most deadly, most threatening hazard at Fuego. And it does produce these PDCs on a relatively frequent basis, as I'll show in a second. But first, I wanted to just point out, again, all the population within the bounds of this hazard map. So this map was produced in 2018, shortly after a larger than normal eruption that you may have heard about that destroyed a town, and I'll talk about that in a minute as well. And so that's what we can see. Oops, I don't know if you can see my cursor, but the brighter red line down the volcano is that PDC in that 2018 eruption. Um, and this is a bit misleading because it makes it look like a pyroclastic flow came down only in that direction during this eruption, whereas actually the pyroclastic flow came down multiple directions and threatened potentially multiple communities in that eruption. But a lot of population around the flanks of the volcanoes, and a lot of the population is actually there in part because of government support, because of government programs that encouraged um, plantation development in Guatemala in the 1800s. So workers from other regions of Guatemala came and established communities in these areas to work on the plantations. And then also after a 30-year-long civil war within Guatemala, several indigenous communities were repatriated and from other parts of Guatemala were then given land on Fuego volcano, one of which, at least one of which, two of which are within high hazard zones. So just a little bit of perspective on how populations end up sometimes in these high risk areas. So like I said, Fuego's persistently active, but then these periods of normal activity are punctuated by stronger activity, what we call paroxysms. And this plot is maybe a little confusing. There's a lot to it. What I wanted to show here, I wanted to point out a few things. So all the vertical lines on the plot are paroxysms. So you can see those thin lines, the fatter lines, those are all paroxysms. So since 1999, there have been a lot of paroxysms, sometimes fewer, sometimes more, sometimes up to one every month or month and a half. So these can be really frequent. And so they sometimes occur very frequently. Not all of them produce observable PDCs. So the length of that line shows us how far down the volcano the largest PDC of that paroxysm came. So those thin lines are when there was probably a PDC, but it was maybe just a couple kilometers up at the top, so we couldn't see it. So all those fatter lines show us paroxysms that generated these longer PDCs. Most PDCs stay confined to channels, but not all do. Populations start around 7 to 8 kilometers from the summit on this plot. That's that horizontal kind of orange line to show all these PDCs that have come down far enough down the volcano that they would reach where those populated areas start. And some of those populated areas are within 200 meters of a channel. Every channel has a population within probably a kilometer of it. And what we really care about is when those PDCs jump out of the channels into potentially populated areas. And the last bit of information on this plot is that not all PDC generated paroxysms trigger evacuations. So the orange vertical lines on this plot show evacuations. And we can see that there are more eruptions that have generated PDCs long enough to reach populations than there are evacuations. So the evacuations don't necessarily correspond to the eruptions that have generated the largest PDCs. All that for a little bit of background on Fuego and why it's so interesting. So while I was studying Fuego, I started after the 2018 disaster and studied that. Plus, there were 2 evacuations after that while I was doing my PhD that I was able to look at as well. So my questions have to do with what information is available for making decisions, in this case about evacuation, which is the only way to avoid death and destruction from PDCs. We can't mitigate for them. We can't build for them. So we need to get out of the way. So how are these evacuation decisions made? I use what's called a mixed methods approach in social sciences with an ethnographic focus. What's ethnography? Well, ethnography is mainly talking to people and observing people. So that's um, doing what are called semi-structured interviews. So interviewing a lot of people, sometimes one-on-one, sometimes in groups, listening sessions or focus groups. So again, talking to people in groups and also observing, like going to meetings, seeing how people interact, listening to what kind of information people are sharing and how people are using that information. Um, and why did I take this approach as opposed to, for example, a survey? Because decision making is complicated. So a survey is going to definitely give us some information, but we won't necessarily learn all the nuances of what goes into people's decision making, what information they trust, what information they don't trust, and why. So the biggest thing I think is the why that we can get at better by having actual conversations with people. So my data sources also included things like official information statements, census data, government records on evacuation. So some records, some geoscience data, as well as these interviews. And this is a map of Fuego showing, this is showing all of the flows that came down in that 2018 eruption, June 2018. So we can see the deadly flow that came down. I don't know if you can see my cursor, but you could also see that flows came down all around the volcano. So we also don't know what channels the PDCs are going to come down in an eruption. There's a lot of uncertainty. Um, each of these dots is a community that I visited. I talked to folks at the yellow dots show where I had recorded interviews with people. And this is just to show that I tried to talk to people living around the volcano to get a variety of perspectives, both within each community and between communities on people's experiences living with this active volcano. I had three main projects, as is typical for a dissertation, and I'm not going to talk about these separately today. The three main projects were what information was available and how was it used in the lead up to that the 2018 disaster, those flows that the destructive flows that came down. How are evacuation decisions made since then? So what about now? How are people using information and making decisions? And then finally, how do cultural gender norms impact evacuation dynamics and decision making? More specifically, my author Elsa Naismith and I talked to women about their evacuation experiences and then analyze that for how we can use those results for risk reduction in the future. So I do want to start though with the June 2018 disaster. For those who aren't familiar, or as a refresher, on June 3rd, 2018, pyroclastic flows and surges from Fuego volcano destroyed part of a golf resort, which we can see if you look at the channel coming diagonally from the top left down towards the bottom right. That channel is called Las Lajas. And up towards the top of the image, you can see this golf resort, a very fancy golf resort and hotel. Then going down channel, Las Lajas Bridge, a major bridge. This is a major thoroughfare taking goods from the coast to the highlands in Guatemala, so economically very important. And then the town of San Miguel Los Lotes down here at a bend in the road, not on the channel, notably not on the channel. Before picture on the left, after picture on the right, we can see that the edge of the resort, while we can see the channel is significantly wider, we can see these PDC deposits, can see that the edge of the resort was destroyed, the bridge was destroyed, and San Miguel Los Lotes, the village, was destroyed. The resort evacuated early in the day. Also, I should mention these paroxysms occur over the course of, say, 16 to 48 hours. So they have a really quick run-up time, which means a very short window for decision making. The resort did evacuate successfully, and there were no deaths. The road to the bridge was closed by authorities before these flows reached it, but there were still people there, locals and actually authorities, and there were probably tens of deaths at the bridge, including one of the authorities, one of the civil protection staff. And the town, there was no organized evacuation or large scale evacuation at the town. It did not evacuate. We know there were hundreds, possibly upwards of 1,000 deaths. Our best guess is around probably 450 to 600 deaths in that community. The community was devastated, and the flows reached just within the community, which means some areas were destroyed, some areas were not. People who were there, many did not survive, and some did, depending on where in the town they were in those moments. So in order to make informed decisions about taking protective action like evacuating, we need to know a few things. We need to know about the hazard. We need a basic understanding of the hazard. We need to know, will I be impacted here where I am? Do I need to worry about this? What is the impact? If this hazard reaches me, is it enough of an impact that I need to worry about? And then what can I do about it? We know from other research that people need to know these basic things in order to be motivated to take action generally. So what did people in San Miguel Los Lotes know? So based on interviews that I did, a few interviews with folks who were survivors, who were there or who had family members there that day, folks told me, for example, but we never thought it was going to do so much because there were so many ravines. We thought that it would come down the ravines, but no. So as a reminder, San Miguel Los Lotes was not right on this ravine. It was to the side. Geologically, we can look at this and see that this was an old lahar and PDC channel, and we can see a bend in the channel. We can see in hindsight where it is likely that San Miguel Los Lotes would be a target for an overflow from a channel. But people living there did not understand that this was a possibility. And this was also, they are also well within the high hazard zone on a previous hazard map. But do people use those hazard maps, and how do they use them, and how do they understand them? So people also were familiar with lahars, but not PDCs. So people were familiar with lahars coming down. People sometimes would go to the bridge to see lahars coming down, and lahars would stay within the channels and move more slowly than PDCs do. So there was also a misunderstanding or lack of understanding about the actual dynamics of pyroclastic density currents. There were times when the smoke descended, like the ash and everything, but we never imagined what it really brought. So these up to this point had come down in previous eruptions, but the PDCs were always up higher on the mountain. So people did see them, but we thought it was just smoke or ash, but we never thought it was bringing branches and rocks and all that. So people didn't understand really what impact the hazard could have. And then did they know what to do about it? The warning was last minute, right? So in this case, civil protection staff did drive by basically as the flows were coming down or shortly before the flows came down and called out a warning for people who were close enough to hear. The warning was last minute, right? Because the authorities were also running, right, in their cars on the highway and with a loudspeaker. And they came saying that people should shut themselves in or get out, whatever they could. So there was a lack of understanding or misunderstanding between both the people living here and, as we can see, the authorities, in this case, civil protection. So not the scientific authorities, but the emergency management authorities, what protective action to take. So in this case, some people did survive by sheltering in place, and others survived by fleeing, but it depended whether they survived or not by taking that action depended on where they were, whether they were right at the edge of the flow or whether they were right in the path of the flow. So there was confusion over protective action, which in the case of PDCs, unless you know you're right at the edge of a flow, sheltering in place is not going to be the best option. You need to get out. So I pulled up this screenshot from Volfilm, which if you're not familiar is a fantastic resource. These are short films that were put together by multiple a collaboration of multiple groups. And the purpose of these films is to show what volcanic hazards are and what they can do. And in this case, from talking with people about their misconceptions of pyroclastic flows, I now watch this video and think, maybe we need more specific information or education about what a pyroclastic flow is and what it can do. So, for example, all the images, all the footage in this video, which is very compelling, is from the outside of the flow. So I think it's easy to imagine that the whole flow is ash, which we as scientists also, or geoscientists, know that is very hot, and that heat, that hot gas alone in ash can kill us. But this also doesn't show the power within the pyroclastic flow. It doesn't show how these flows can bury us. It doesn't show how these flows have big rocks that can bludgeon anything in their path. So understanding people's misconceptions can help us to make better outreach products and help us think more, maybe more creatively about how to help people internalize these hazards, where they live, what can happen to them, what those impacts can be. So here's a picture that I took of San Miguel Los Lotes 3 years after the disaster, and you can see the size of the rocks that came down in the flow. And to me, it's something that's very visceral, and maybe it won't be compelling for everyone, but for me, I saw the size of these rocks and was pretty shocked and could imagine the force of this flow coming down. They didn't all land in this pile the way this pile is. These are rocks that were pulled out during excavations as people were trying to recover loved ones who were buried by the flows. So this is a collection of boulders, but all of these boulders were found within the community. And you can see on the upper right of the picture, you can see rocks of these size still in place. Like I mentioned, the resort did evacuate in time, and I'm not going to get into the details of the day and the resort versus San Miguel Los Lotes, the town, but I do want to make one point here, which is that risk reduction and a successful evacuation is not any one thing. It's a lot of things. It's a lot of factors that have to all come together, including luck, which I just realized I failed to put on this list. But we need to understand the hazard, understand what it is, where it can occur, what to do about it. We need to be able to recognize the signs, and we also need all these social components to work. We need clear decision-making protocols. We need a plan to respond. We need the resources to respond and to practice responding, and the ability and willingness to absorb whatever risk comes with responding, which I'll talk more about. But evacuation does come with a significant amount of risk. The resort had all these things. San Miguel Los Lotes basically had none of these things, but without the understanding of the hazard, it's hard to have any of the other things because you have nothing to build on. So the point I wanted to make here is that geoscience can certainly not provide all of the factors that are needed to effectively reduce reduction or to effectively provoke evacuation. But we do provide the foundational element, which is the understanding of the hazards. And without that basic understanding, we really can't reduce risk otherwise. Okay, taking a breath. What about now? what about since then? So did that experience change the way things are done around Fuego? Has it changed people's understanding of the hazard? I think bottom line, it has, and yet, there's still a very diverse understanding of PDCs around the volcano. There's diverse trust in authorities, which is important when it comes to deciding when to evacuate, when that advice is coming, if that advice is coming from authorities. And there's also diversity in plans for evacuation or strategies within and between and even within the different communities. So for example, one interviewee in a town called Guadalupe said, no lava comes down here. And when people refer to lava, is a word that's used to refer to anything coming off the volcano. So he's not talking necessarily about lava flows, but he could be talking about lahars, in this case, probably talking about PDCs. No lava comes down here. It doesn't come down here because there are ravines. There are ravines. It jumps out of that one, gets into another ravine, and goes down. So he's saying in this location, we're safe because of the ravines. And that doesn't track with what the scientists who made this map determined for this area. So I put a yellow circle there where this town is, and it's pretty squarely within the designated high hazard zone, acknowledging that scientists are not perfect and there's diversity of opinions with between scientists as well as where about where these lines should be drawn. And I also want to acknowledge that the person who's pointing here in the picture has a different perspective. He's not the person that this quote is from. He's a community leader, and he had taken me up to this high point near the community to point out that they're in a low-lying area that's part of a fan or apron coming off the slopes of the volcano, and they actually are subject, because of their terrain, to future pyroclastic flows. And that was within the same community. Like I said, the trust and authorities vary as well. So anywhere from I'm willing to follow the rules, and if they say that we have to go, we have to go, to we get together to see what the authorities are going to do to make the best decision. So we take what they're going to do into consideration in our decisions, to we do believe a little of what they say. But what we believe more is what we've seen. So people have been living with some of the people living here have been, suffice to say, all the people, well, anyone who's born in this area has been living with the volcano their whole lives. And some in their childhoods experienced very large eruptions that resulted in them evacuating and being displaced from their homes for an extended period of time. So people's experiences are also informing their perception of the volcano and decisions about evacuation. So what signs do people watch for then if they're, using their own information or their own impressions as well as the authorities' advice? We asked people consistently, like, how do you know when to evacuate? How do you make that decision? Where do you get your information from, and what's that information? So one source of information is the authorities. Another source is their own observations. For example, this community leader said, we've learned from the sounds, aside from the trainings they've given us. So the authorities have come in and giving trainings, mainly civil protection or civil defense, emergency management in the US. Aside from the trainings they've given us, we've learned from the volcano itself. It booms pretty hard from the explosions. We know that the corrugated metal trembles. So that's what we hear normally. Pause on that. That's normal. But when it thunders like a locomotive, this means that it has to be in the eruption phase. That puts it on alert. So these are people who are very accustomed to normal, what's become normal for them, normal rumblings of the volcano, a volcano that is very much in unrest. And what they look for or listen for is the signs that authorities have taught them about, like the sound of the locomotive. This is something that we heard from many people around the volcano. But also anything that's out of the normal, particularly loud explosions, continuous explosions, shock waves, this lava descending, which would be PDCs descending, smell of sulfur, the sky getting darker. So a lot of things that that generate a fear response. So not thinking about, oh, this means the volcano is doing XYZ. This is unusual, this is really intense, and I'm scared. Another thing that a lot of people told us, in particular, mothers said that, oh, well, it's when when my child was crying, then I left. So a lot of people are also, this was said as though it was a sign to leave. How did you decide when to leave? Oh, my son was crying, so we left. So people also very much using social cues as reasons to evacuate as well, especially when it comes to protecting their families. So getting back to evacuation statistics a bit, evacuation numbers are generally pretty low. I pause saying generally because evacuation hasn't happened that many times. But when there has been a government-supported evacuation, numbers are well below 100% for a number of reasons. Many people do not evacuate when the volcano is in paroxysm. One example is here, showing just the end of that time series that I showed before. So we have 3 paroxysms that generated PDCs longer than 6 kilometers, made it to or almost to 7 kilometers. And that 7 kilometers, remember 7 to 8 is about where populations start on the volcano. So one was in March 2022, another in December 22, another in May 2023. And of these 3, only 2 spurred evacuations. In all 3 cases, the longest PDCs, the ones that are shown here, came down in the same channel, so threatened the same populations. So we might expect that all 3 of these would trigger evacuations because they're all similar situations, threatening similar populations. And yet there was an evacuation in March, an evacuation in May, no evacuation in December. Why was that? That eruption happened at night. So harder to see. PDCs are more difficult to see at night. They are mostly silent or very quiet, so you don't necessarily hear them. So people didn't necessarily know that there were PDCs coming down the volcano. So detection can be an issue, especially at night or with clouds. So when we're relying on signs that we can observe alone without instrumentation, there's a real weakness there depending on weather and environmental factors. Also at night, people are less likely to be motivated to evacuate. It's dark, it's scarier, can't see. People perceive roads as less safe. People's children are already in bed. Everybody's in and feeling safe in their houses. So it's both the detection issue that can be a problem at night or in low visibility, and also people's motivations. Social structures may prevent people from evacuating. Run through some of the other factors that may prevent people from evacuating. For example, social dynamics between men and women in households. This is a group interview. The first woman says, "We can't make the decision, the men do." Second woman, "Well, we did make the decision, but to have things ready, telling children, look, we're ready because let's see what your dad says or see what the authority says." So women do have some agency. They get their families ready, but in some cases, families, women and children may not evacuate if their partners don't want to evacuate or don't want them to evacuate. Oh, and also churches, a pastor may tell people not to evacuate, or people may get criticized. We heard in some interviews that people were questioned, their faith in God was questioned with their decision to evacuate. Well, do you not have faith in God? Why are you leaving? Do you not have faith in Him making these decisions for us? Concerns about livelihoods may also prevent people from evacuating. It's hard to leave our belongings, leave our animals, our spouses without meals. It's painful. So in this case, Women make the meals for the men. Men generally stay on the volcano to protect or stay in their homes to protect property while women evacuate with the children and elderly. So women are then leaving their responsibilities. They're leaving their responsibilities to their husbands. They're leaving their belongings, their animals, as in small livestock. This is important because many families rely on small livestock for feeding their families. And even officials may have concerns with calling evacuations or mustering resources because of concerns about their job and their position. When people say, yes, we're going to evacuate, that's when you begin to mobilize resources, not proactively. Because if no one evacuates, then it becomes a problem for you. Then it's for nothing, then the repercussions fall on you. So everyone's concerned about the repercussions, livelihood repercussions of an unnecessary evacuation. Oops. And I spoke to one woman who said, I asked her why she didn't evacuate in November 2018 when there was an organized evacuation in her community. And she said, because there's the will of God, right? Yes. And she paused and said, because it's hard. It's hard to be in another place. So, on one hand, people may be leaving their fate up to God. On the other hand, that may be a psychological crutch for the difficulty of facing the unknown and hardship of evacuating. So, I'm going to leave this in the hands of God, partly because it's so hard. Evacuation is just, it's hard. People always also have concern about evacuation safety, and this may prevent people from evacuating. We didn't rush out right away because it might be more dangerous to run away because we're leaving right at the moment that the eruption is already happening. So uh, I I pointed out, or we saw that there were these channels coming down the volcano that channel PDCs and lahars. Um, these channels, for the most part, don't have bridges across them. Several do, many do not, where people have to cross in order to evacuate. So people have to cross these channels that are indeed dangerous. They may have pyroclastic flows coming down during the rainy season. These routes are often cut off by lahars. So some people think, well, it's going to be more dangerous to evacuate and to get out than it is to stay in my home. And because of this, some people come up with alternative strategies. Well, we're going to go for a high hill here nearby instead of evacuating because we could get caught in one of these channels or get caught between the channels and then we're stuck. We know that when it's in the channels, it's better not to approach the channel. So why would we go towards danger when we could stay in our homes and be safer? But if it comes from above, then you have to withdraw fully. So this is coming from someone who experienced an eruption in 1974, where tephra fell up to a meter and a half where he lived. And so he's thinking, and it caused a lot of destruction. So he's thinking, well, when it comes from the sky, when it's tephra, that's when you have to go. Otherwise, stay home and safe. This community would be cut off if uh, pyroclastic flows came down and destroyed their route out. And also they are in not the highest, but the moderate PDC zone. So people have relative perceptions of risk that may or may not be skewed, be incorrect based on their experiences. And then finally, lack of resources may prevent people from evacuating. So a lot of these things have nothing to do with geoscience. This is about resources, logistics, and social dynamics. And they told us to leave, to evacuate, but by foot from here to the main road. This is a woman talking about civil protection, saying that they needed to evacuate, and for her to go on foot. It's, as for many women in this area, it's her without her husband, probably because he and maybe the eldest sons would stay back to protect their homes. But it's her with probably several children, maybe an elder family member or two. And it's difficult to walk these routes out. And in these areas, most people, not just many, but most people don't have transportation. And if they do have transportation, it's a motorcycle. And in some parts of the volcano, there are very few to no women who know how to drive. So there are some real transportation limitations. And this picture that I have on the right is showing a pretty chock full pickup truck from the volunteer firefighters in the evacuation of March 2022. My friend and colleague Elsa and I were texting a friend of ours in town who sent this to us. We said, "Are you going to evacuate?" She said, "Look how our neighbors go. I'm not going to evacuate. I have to make cheese." And we're like, "You have to make cheese? Is cheese really that important?" And then when we were able to talk to her, she elaborated and pointed out that it seemed so unsafe to go in this crowded vehicle where the driver doesn't know the route, and maybe she and her kids are going to fall out because she has to go with her kids and all their things. And so to her, it was very much not safe to go. And also to her, the eruption was subsiding by the time transportation came. So that timing is also really important. Okay, so a few thoughts here. This is the evacuation conundrum. So on one hand, we have all our volcanic threat information, which we as geoscientists probably want to be first and foremost. But on the other hand, we have everything else. And a lot of these concerns are very, very valid concerns. I live day to day, and if I lose my livestock, whoa, that's going to be really hard for my family. So will somebody steal my things? Will my livestock die? Will we get hurt en route? Will we lose work? Some of these we can address, at least in part, with geoscience. Will we get hurt en route? Well, we can't speak to the trucks necessarily or the quality of transportation, but we can look at the relative hazard and hopefully communicate the relative hazard or risk of driving across the evacuation route versus staying in place in a given location. So those are the kind of things that if we know what people are actually concerned about, hopefully we can hone some of our geoscience information, including research, to be able to better provide information that's going to inform good decision making. So what we want to do from my perspective is weight this volcanic threat info side. We want the focus to be on that and lighten up the everything else side. Unfortunately, we don't have a lot of control over the everything else side because that's generally what's left to emergency management or civil protection. But we can impact this volcanic threat side and hopefully weight it down with good information. We can improve understanding through outreach and education, again, by knowing what people need, what the misconceptions are, or what information they're using in their strategies, risk reduction strategies. And we can reduce uncertainty through better science and focusing our science on questions that reduce uncertainty in these situations. So better forecasting, better understanding of the conditions that can lead to these particularly large PDCs. And there are people working on this. Understanding, though, that that alone is not enough to result in successful evacuation. So my closing thought for you all is that to provide useful information, we need to understand information needs through engaging directly with the various users of our information. And then we can ask and address questions like, on what understanding of the hazards are people basing their risk reduction strategies? Where can we reduce uncertainty and provide a more detailed hazard assessment if needed? And on what timescales do people need information? And then ideally work with the people who are impacted, who need to make decisions to be able to provide the best information we can and also set expectations for what information we can and can't provide. That's it. Hopefully I've left some time for questions and ideally discussion. My email's there if anybody wants to reach out to me. And I'm currently using, not using this work, but using these methods in my postdoc. And I'm looking at our long-term hazard assessments, asking the same questions. How can we better provide information that people need to make long-term decisions about risk reduction around volcanoes? And that's it. I don't know if anybody's still even on here. It's the beauty of the beauty and challenge of virtual presentations. I can't see anybody. I'll go ahead and stop share. And
Thank
I'm
you so
really,
much. Mhm.
oh, sorry. Well, I was just gonna say, I'm really curious if people in whoever's here in your own research, do you see ways that that your research can inform, ideally, even at some point down the road, inform risk reduction along subduction zones? Big question. Maybe nobody wants to answer it.
Thank you. I think I can start asking the question. Um, so it is really cool that you're really studying the geohazards and trying to really make decisions. I do have like a question. I did a summer internship this year. I'm like studying the structure of a fault zone. I think it's like really, really related to the government's decision making or something. But from my side, I'm working on the pure seismology doing imaging. I feel it's very hard to really communicate to somebody who is making the decisions. I feel like we are working like in different threads and I can't really contribute to that.
Yeah. Do you feel it's because you don't know who, you feel too far removed from the people making the decisions, or your research is removed from the decision-making process? Both. I think, yeah, I mean, I think we can always be working to communicate our research, even if it's not going to be directly informing decisions, even if it helps to better understand what a subduction zone is and what they can do and on what timescales. Um, I think that's all important information, and information that you're probably learning some about in your, you said you're doing seismic imaging. Yeah. Yeah. So the fact that I don't know what aspect of subduction zones you're looking at, but um, just being able to understand what the earth looks like down there is going to tell us something about what could happen in the future.
Thank you. I believe that like by combining all of our results, we can finally make some contribution to the society. So here's another question from Alex Newsom. You can see that in the chat, but I'm just like to read it loud so people can catch up later in the YouTube video. So Alex asked, the volcano I am currently studying is not currently active, but an adjacent one in the system is undergoing inflation that some people are concerned about. But it is hard to help non-geologists connect detailed geochemical data and models with what they understand as a fleshy potential eruption. How do you approach explaining your research to non-specialists?
Yeah, so I think for especially things like geochemical data, which are right, very very technical, and probably taken years of chemistry and geochemistry to get to the point that you're at for understanding the data. I think getting to the highest level why of what you're doing is really important. So what does the geochemical data tell you about the volcano that can matter to somebody? So for example, if the geochemical data tells you that the uh, the volcano is, X% of silica, that's not helpful. So what does that percentage tell you about the volcano? Or if you're looking at like the depth that the magma is cooling, why does that matter? So why does the whatever you're studying take that what and then ask why does this matter? And then that's the part that's going to be interesting to somebody who doesn't know the geochemistry. So what's your end goal? And sometimes we have to think beyond our research because we're so focused on our research that we're solving a small part of a bigger problem, and we need to think of what that bigger problem is. So what we really want to do is understand how quickly volcanoes can go from quiet to active, for example. And I don't know, in this case, I don't know what the research, what Alex's research is addressing. But maybe that's the big question, but we even forget that's the big question because we think, well, what I'm trying to figure out is how quickly this magma went from, this point in the crust to a kilometer higher or whatever. And so we need to be able to ask the bigger questions of, really what broad question are we trying to address with this research? I don't know if that makes sense, but a lot of times we have to be able to step back. Okay, great.
We get another question from Mike. And he says, "Hi, Beth, great talk. How do we overcome the I know what the signs are mindset when trying to help with scientific forecasting and evacuation decision making?"
Yeah, what was it? How do we get over the I know what? Sorry.
What the signs are mindset?
Oh, I know what the signs are. And Mike, you're asking for residents as opposed to scientists. I don't know if he can unmute, maybe not.
Yeah, he said yes.
Yes, yes. I think that's really tricky, and I think a lot of it comes down to trust and putting in the long-term effort to build. Yay, hi Mike. Putting in the long-term effort to build trust with at-risk populations, or emergency management, whoever, and then be heard better to say, yes, that is what we know up to this point, and what the geology tells us, or the geoscience tells us, or the monitoring tells us is that the volcano can do something bigger. And I think that that message is hard to to convey and to be heard without having those relationships in place.
Thanks, Beth. That was my guess at an answer. But yeah, I mean, your study really sort of clarifies that getting in and talking to folks to better understand even what their thought process is on evacuation, creates a lot more understanding for us in terms of strategies for communicating. But yeah, I do have that worry that I'm not going to evacuate until I see X sign. Seems to be a potential barrier for improved strategies for evacuation. But I think you're right. The trust building is going to be a critical component to get there. I'm maybe I'll ask the follow-up question of what do you think leads to better trust building in cases like this?
Yeah, unfortunately, what I know so far about trust building in cases like this is a lot of persistent contact. So being a familiar face and then also getting it right enough or right at least close enough to right enough that people do start to trust you as a source. And that's maybe more in the case of frequently active volcanoes like Tungurahua or Fuego, where there are multiple paroxysmal eruptions and people can start to say, oh yeah, the scientists said this was going to happen and it did. But that means you have to be able to put the time in to be present, and also be right, or have people be able to correlate what the information that you're giving with what they also observe. And I'd have to think more about, how much that's specific to a volcanic context. But being that familiar face is I think the most important thing in these kinds of cases.
We got
And
in. Mhm.
oh,
We
sorry, go
got,
ahead.
we just got another comment from Eating. Thank you so much for the insightful talk. It was fascinating to hear about the interviews and how people perceive risk and what influences their decision-making processes. I found the part on gender perspectives particularly compelling, as it reminded me of a talk by Virginia Le Mason, where she discussed her research on how to address gender inequality in the International Disaster Reduction Framework.
Yeah, there's a lot of really good information about it. And one thing that I found really striking about our work in Guatemala, so I just posted that it's an open access paper. That's the one part of this work that's been published, is what we heard from women in Guatemala is like aligns almost perfectly with what another researcher heard from women in Florida evacuating from a hurricane. So we may think of Guatemala as a very patriarchal and gendered society, and people, I've heard people say, oh yeah, like the moms are all about their kids, it's all about the babies. But if we look at responses from women making evacuation decisions, sorry, mothers in particular making evacuation decisions, in Florida, it's like the same things that you hear is women prioritizing their children, and also often men staying behind to protect property while women evacuate with children and potentially elderly. And I also want to acknowledge that that this paper is it treats gender as it looks at a gender binary, because that's what we saw expressed in that region, and non non binary, non-binary gender identifying individuals have specific and even more challenging issues with risk reduction, including with evacuation. So gender is it's a challenging and super interesting topic in disaster research.
Thank you, Beth. This is very, very interesting. And we thank you for the presentation and introduction to everything. And this is like a very successful start of our webinar. Thank you again. And we will have our next webinar in 2 weeks at the same time by Christian. His title is sorry, the origin of tectonic melanges and implication for the subduction interface processes. Looking forward to see you next week, the week after the next week. Bye. Thank you. Have a good one.